Petra, I understand you have reservations about the idea of resilience. This intrigues me because as environmentalists we're always advocating the importance of resilience. Can you explain why you have reservations about the term?
Well, reservations is probably slightly too harsh of a term. I think it's fair to say that I actually am a big fan of social ecological resilience. The way resilience is framed as the ability to absorb shocks and stressors and continue working and functioning and living. I also like the definition of resilience around anticipation, around learning, around experimentation.
Yes.
And I've used it in my own work, participatory research around climate change adaptation and resilience. In Ghana, in Tanzania, we've used the concept of resilience around the notion of envisioning futures, engaging in futures, anticipating harm before it can happen so that we can prepare for it without going through that experience of harm and loss. And I think in that respect it is quite useful.
Right.
However, what I see happening now around the discourse of resilience is the fact that it is appropriated by other forces, neoliberal thinking, neoliberal ways of running our economy. And resilience is now used as the new buzzword, the new catchword. And we are asked to become resilient. You and I are asked to become resilient in a world that is increasingly uncertain, that science cannot really predict. And what that shift in discourse around resilience does is that it creates resilient subjects, people who are asked to take on responsibility even though they may be the ones that are most affected by climate change, by environmental disasters, other disasters. And that, I think, is worrisome. And I think as critical scholars, we have an obligation to be careful to pick it up when resilience, or the use of the term resilience shifts from something that can be very empowering and flourishing to something that narrows identities down to self-care and self-help, where the state then apparently, supposedly, has no longer any obligation to help people in need. And that's why I have reservations.
So Petra, as a geographer, that's your training, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
As a geographer, you are now working, I gather, on the science of loss. Can you explain to us, we often don't associate those two terms, science and loss.
Indeed, I am a geographer by training. I call myself a human environment geographer. I'm interested in the relationships between people, society, and nature. And most of my work over the last 10 years has been in the context of climate change. Climate change, poverty, eradication, development in the broadest sense. And so what I've seen is that there's a lot of interest in the science of climate change adaptation. And I've worked on the IPCC, on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and adaptation is a big topic within the IPCC. However, we now realize that adaptation alone, or even in combination with mitigation, will not be sufficient to prevent all damages everywhere to all people now and in future generations. So there's an interest in damages and loss, and the two may sound very similar. According to the UN definition, damages are types of harm that are reversible, right, and loss is not. Irreversible, right? And this, of course, is tricky because how do we determine now what becomes irreversible loss and what not? But what we see, especially from the perspective of human geographers who have done quite a bit of work on adaptation, community adaptation, limits to adaptation, social tipping points in adaptation, we see that there are various dimensions of loss that we may want to call intangible, invisible. They escape us, right? If you ask me if, for example, a bridge gets destroyed during a flooding event, during a hurricane, how much it would cost to rebuild that bridge, I probably could tell you. I could ask an engineer. It's not too difficult. But when we talk about intangible, invisible dimensions of loss, like identity, human dignity, security, sense of place, sense of belonging. We know they're important, but we also know we cannot measure them, and we probably should not measure them. So there's a lot of growing interest into, well, these intangible losses and the science of loss. And it's a new paper colleagues and I, predominantly geographers, just have published in Nature and Climate Change, leads us to very, very important questions. And these are, we cannot talk about loss simply from the perspective of climate projections, risk assessments, insurance companies. We need to understand what people value in their daily lives, which of the things people value may be acceptable if they lost them. Some things we just cannot protect, and maybe they're not even that important to us. But some things people definitely value, and I think they will continue to value them in the future. They may not make sense to you and to me, but they're important in people's daily lives. And we need to find out. This is what the science of loss is all about. And then engage in what we call preemptive ways of dealing with grief and loss for things, aspects, objects, objectives of our lives that we will not be able to preserve. And the science of loss, I think, will help us in doing so.